Sean, I always imagine professional services firms thrive in a crisis, but in your experience, that's not always the case.
Absolutely. Professional services firms have the same issues as any other business out there. Those issues can be cash flow issues, WIP lockup, and obviously generation of new work.
So what in particular has been happening this time around during coronavirus?
Well, COVID presented some very significant problems. And if I focus on the legal sector just slightly, what we found is that over the last 9 months, there's been a decline in across the board for the provision of legal services. The Law Society has mentioned figures of 10 to 20%. And if you take a 10 to 20% decline in revenue, then obviously it's going to impact a number of firms out there significantly.
And I know you track professional indemnity insurance. This is the cost of insuring the work that lawyers do on a day-to-day basis. And that cost has been going up.
Well, you're absolutely right. About a month or so ago was the main renewal for PII policies within law firms, and the market took a very stringent approach and hardening approach in respect of the cost of those premiums. So what we've seen is that many firms have had a significant increase in the premium that they paid last year. So effectively, at a time when they're already strapped for cash, they've had a significant increase in last year's premium. And also we've seen, rather than firms literally just getting the invoice and paying it, they've actually had to pitch to the professional indemnity insurer in order to support their application for their renewal.
So what's your feeling? Do you think we're going to be heading for more collapses in the legal industry going into 2021?
Absolutely. I think more failures, unfortunately, are inevitable. There's been more mergers and consolidations within the sector over the last few years, along with some notable high-profile failures. But going into next year, whilst we won't see it this year, next year will be a particularly difficult time for law firms because the declining turnovers this year are going to play into effect on their cash flows next year. And don't forget, whilst there's been some government support for businesses out there, including professional service firms such as CBILS and deferment of VAT and partner tax payments, a lot of them are going to come into the fore next year. So where you've had a year where there's been some declining revenues, going into next year, there's going to be some big cash outlays that are going to have to be dealt with.
Well, these are all people businesses. So how do you prevent people walking out the door when times are tough?
I think that's a very good question, James. And I think if anyone knew the answer to that question indefinitely, then they'd be a very rich person. I think one thing to comment on that is that typically, whilst remuneration for partners and staff is obviously quite a big factor, there's also the cultural fit of the firm, but also the strategic direction that the firm is travelling in. Law firms or professional services firms are people businesses. And if partners do not buy into the strategy that the firm is adopting, then those partners will leave.
So you mentioned the cultural point, Sean. I'm interested in how these firms are being run differently. They all have very big, very expensive headquarters in city centres, but currently most people are working from home. And yet there's still the cost of these leases of these buildings going forward.
Absolutely. Whilst they might not be paying the full lease costs at the moment, ultimately those lease costs are going to come back into next year, and any deferment of payments if they can't structure a deal with the landlords. But it's a massive problem. Leases are very difficult to get out of. You have to wait for break clauses, and therefore it is a massive cost effectively for the firm that is not being utilised. Ultimately, professional services firms are people working in buildings, billing clients. And at the moment, you've got people working from home. So as you say, you've got this massive cost that's not being utilised effectively. Who knows where we're going to be next year? But my prediction is that the return to the office on a 5-day a week is just never going to come back.
Sean, if you take together that there are firms with quite long-term, quite expensive leases, and also this tradition that the surplus every year is largely distributed between all of the partners in the firm, isn't there a case that these firms maybe should have been run more carefully, more conservatively in recent years?
You could say that if someone has a very expensive lease with the fish tank in the atrium, then obviously there's a question as to whether that should have been paid for, or whether you need potentially that style of building going forward. But ultimately, until such time as a lease can be restructured, it is a cost that the firm will have to bear, and ultimately it reflects in partners' profits and distributions.
What about the role of lenders in this situation, and also the Solicitors Regulation Authority, the main regulator for the legal sector? What do you think is going through their minds?
Well, the SRA acts as effectively the policeman for the sector. The SRA's role is the protection of client interests, and that's ultimately what it's there to do, to ensure that clients receive the service that they're supposed to receive, and that any interests that they have are sufficiently protected. So the regulator, whilst to be interested in how firms are performing, it will have a bit of a laissez-faire approach in respect of the firm's profitability. Though lenders is a completely separate situation. We're going to see on the 1st of December, the HMRC will be elevated to preferential status, and therefore on any restructuring in a formal insolvency, HMRC will rank in priority to any lender where there is a fixed and floating charge, given that most assets within a professional services firm, being WIP and debtors, are floating charge assets. So it's going to be interesting, the appetite of lenders going forward, as to whether they will continue to provide existing facilities, and or when new facilities are required, whether they require partners to provide guarantees in respect of new facilities, or to put in additional capital into the firm.
So we have tougher times and higher cost of doing business. How does that impact on the partners in a law firm and also their clients?
Clients are always going to be price sensitive, so I think for any firm to just increase their costs, increase their costs onto clients, is going to find it very difficult. So firms need to not only have a 6-month forecast, but a 12 to 24-month forecast, and really nail down how some of these hard costs can be restructured over the next year or two.
Sean, in your opinion, how does this sector emerge from the downturn? Are we going to see fewer firms? Are we going to see more PLCs and fewer partnerships?
We've been forecasting more consolidation for some time, and it's fair to say there's been more mergers, acquisitions and failures in the sector over the last 5 or 6 years. Going forward, ultimately, there is going to be more consolidation, and given the issues that COVID has presented in the declining turnovers for this year, there is ultimately going to be significant failures going forward. The issue that professional services firms happen, especially law firms with its regulator, is unlike a widget business, you can't just turn the tap off and close. There has to be a very managed exit. So where boards are watching their cash flow and watching their business, if they feel that they are going to come into difficult waters, then even if there is going to be a failure, that failure has to be managed very, very carefully, because as well as their stakeholders, i.e. their employees, their creditors, their lenders, they have the SRA. And the SRA, as we've shown recently, is more than happy to intervene into a firm, and therefore managing the SRA as one key stakeholder is critical to ensuring that there is a managed exit.
Well, you've been around this sector for a long time. You worked on the King & Wood Mallisons collapse, and also Ince & Co., which are two very, very recent examples of law firms getting into trouble. What would your advice be now to senior partners of those firms that have seen a real sharp decline in business?
So you need to have a clear plan that's in place. That clear plan has to have the buy-in of all of the partners and all of the board, so that everyone is aligned on what needs to be done. Also, take advice wherever possible. Advice is going to be key in respect of navigating those waters and ensuring that not only your lenders are happy with the decisions that are being taken, but also the regulator is satisfied that decisions that are being taken are in the best interest of clients as well as creditors.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.